The cold had a way of biting through every layer of clothing, but for Ethan Miller that night, the chill came less from the wind and more from the sound of his father's voice echoing through the hallway. The words cut deeper than the frost in the air. He was a disgrace, a shame, no longer a son. What had begun as the trembling courage to confess his truth ended with the slam of a door behind him and the cruel silence of a family who turned away when he needed them most. Ethan was 17, a quiet boy in a town where everyone's eyes seemed to weigh more than their words. For years, he had kept his heart locked away, but love has a way of breaking through walls. Daniel, his classmate with the easy smile and careless charm, had been the first to make Ethan believe he was not alone. They whispered about futures too big for the small town, about apartments in cities that never slept, about dreams stitched together with the reckless thread of youth. But the fantasy collapsed faster than Ethan could hold it. Daniel walked away, leaving only a trail of silence and the unbearable truth that lingered in Ethan's body. A test confirmed what he already feared: HIV. It was not just the diagnosis that broke him, but the way he imagined every look, every word from others turning into a weapon. Still, he gathered the last fragments of courage and told his parents, not with defiance, but with the fragile hope that family might stand closer when the world pulled away. Paul and Ellen did not step closer. They recoiled. The living room, once filled with the scent of dinners and the echoes of television, became a courtroom where Ethan was sentenced without mercy. His mother's face hardened, his father's voice thundered, and their verdict was final. He was no longer welcome, no longer theirs. That night, Ethan packed his life into a torn backpack. The zipper stuck, the fabric frayed, but it was all he had. The walls that had witnessed his childhood stood cold and unfamiliar as he walked out into the dark. Snowflakes clung to his eyelashes. Melting into tears he refused to let fall. In his hand was only a slip of paper with a number written on it, the single line of hope left in a world that had turned its back. Grandma Rose, the woman whose hugs smelled of lavender, whose voice had always been a soft place to land, the only person who had never asked him to be anything other than himself. His fingers shook as he dialed, unsure if she would answer, unsure if he deserved her kindness after carrying so much silence for so long. The phone rang once, twice, then her voice, steady and warm, broke through the emptiness. She did not ask why he was calling so late, nor why his words trembled with fear. She simply told him to come, and so Ethan stepped into the night, the frozen air cutting at his lungs, the weight of rejection pressing heavier with each step. But somewhere ahead, a light still burned for him. Somewhere a door would open, not to judgment, but to love. For those listening now, remember, sometimes family is not the blood that casts you out, but the arms that gather you in when the rest of the world decides you are too heavy to hold. And if this story moves you, make sure to stay with Heart Story, because here, we tell the stories that others turn away from, and we remind you that every life, no matter how broken it begins, can still carry hope. When Ethan arrived at the small wooden house at the edge of town, the porch light was already on. Grandma Rose stood at the doorway, her silver hair pinned back, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of peppermint and soap. She did not ask for explanations. She simply reached out, pulled him into her arms, and let him breathe for the first time since his world had fallen apart. Her hug carried no conditions, no questions, only the quiet assurance that he was safe. The days that followed blurred between hospital visits and the kind of care only a grandmother can give. Rose sat beside him through each test, through each consultation where doctors spoke in words too heavy for a 17-year-old to hold. Ethan heard phrases like treatment plans, immune counts, and strict routines, and his chest grew tight with fear. He wondered if his life was already measured in months rather than years. At night, when he lay in the small bedroom with quilts stitched decades ago, he listened to the sound of his grandmother moving around the kitchen, the clinking of teacups, the hum of a hymn, and for brief moments, it calmed him. But fear never left completely. Sometimes he stared at the mirror, at the face that seemed to belong to someone else, and thought of the classmates who would never understand, He replayed the memory of his parents' rejection again and again, the echo of his father's voice telling him he was a shame. Some nights, he wanted to disappear into that voice, to surrender to the belief that he was broken beyond repair. Rose noticed. She always noticed. One evening, she sat him down at the kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp pooling between them. She reached across and held his hand, her palm rough from years of labor. "How long you live," she said softly, "is not nearly as important as how you live. Pain will come, but so will beauty. Don't let fear be the only thing you leave behind." Then she did something Ethan did not expect. She led him to a corner of the house where an old sewing machine sat beneath a cloth cover. Its body was scratched and dull with age, its wheels stiff from years of disuse, but it carried the weight of history. "This belonged to your grandfather," Rose said. "He built a life with these stitches. He believed that with thread and patience, you could turn scraps into something worth keeping. Now it's yours." Ethan ran his fingers over the machine, feeling the cool metal and the grooves worn by another pair of hands long gone. At first, he laughed nervously. He had no skill, no training, nothing but a jumble of memories from watching his grandmother mend clothes when he was a child. But Rose placed a small bundle of fabric on the table and told him to try. The first attempts were clumsy. The thread tangled, the needle jammed, and Ethan muttered under his breath at his own mistakes. Yet Rose never corrected him harshly. She watched with quiet patience, offering only gentle encouragement, reminding him that every crooked line could be unstitched and sewn again. Slowly, the rhythm of the machine became a rhythm for his heart. Each stitch, however uneven, felt like a piece of himself being pieced back together. In time, Ethan discovered something remarkable. The machine did not just mend fabric, it mended him. The act of turning discarded scraps into something new mirrored his own life. A boy discarded by his parents, now slowly crafting a future from what remained. The small room filled with the steady hum of the machine became his sanctuary. Rose often sat nearby, knitting or sipping tea, watching him with quiet pride. She never asked about Daniel, never scolded him for mistakes, never once mentioned shame. Instead, she created a space where he could rebuild not just clothes, but himself. The house smelled of fabric dust and peppermint tea, the windows frosted by winter. But inside there was warmth, the kind of warmth that stitched itself into his bones. Ethan still carried fear. He still woke some nights thinking about hospitals and endings. But each morning, when the light fell across the old sewing machine, he found a reason to sit down and try again. The threads he wove were not just designs on cloth, they were promises to himself that he was not finished yet. In those quiet months, Ethan learned something his parents never understood. Love is not proven by words shouted in anger or by rules that suffocate. It is proven in the steady hand that guides you when you are trembling, in the patient voice that tells you to try again, in the gift of an old sewing machine that says your story is not over. And from that truth, a boy once cast out began to imagine a life worth living. Years slipped quietly into the background, measured not by the rejection that once defined him, but by the rhythm of a sewing machine that had become his anchor. Ethan Miller grew from a fragile boy into a disciplined young man. The early fear of his diagnosis had not vanished, but it no longer dictated every thought. He learned how to live with structure medication at dawn, nutritious meals, sleep on time, and above all, a determination to prove that survival could be turned into art. With each passing season, his craft deepened. What began as crooked seams on discarded fabric turned into tailored shirts, and then into jackets sharp enough to carry their own voice. Neighbors who once only pitied the boy living with his grandmother now brought clothes to be mended. Word spread slowly, not just about his skill, but about the way he treated every garment as if it were a story worth saving. Encouraged by Rose, Ethan transformed the small storage room behind her house into a workshop. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of bolts of fabric stacked against the walls. Sunlight spilled through a cracked window onto spools of thread arranged like a rainbow of possibility. Here, Ethan was not the boy abandoned at 17. He was a designer with a vision. His hands moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had stitched his own heart back together, but his dream carried a deeper purpose. Ethan remembered the faces of others like him. Young men and women whispered about, mocked, or left behind because of who they were. He wanted his work to be more than clothing. He wanted it to be armor for those still learning how to stand tall in a world that tried to bend them. And so he began to design not just for style, but for identity. He created suits for queer youth attending their first dances, gowns for trans women who wanted to feel seen, jackets embroidered with symbols of pride that made wearers feel less alone. It was in this growing circle of courage that Ethan met Adam. Adam was a photographer, soft-spoken yet sharp-eyed, capturing beauty where others failed to look. He came to the workshop first to document Ethan's designs for a small magazine feature. His camera lens lingered not only on the clothes, but on the quiet fire behind Ethan's movements. Through the click of shutters in the exchange of ideas, admiration turned into companionship. Adam saw not a boy defined by illness or rejection, but an artist turning survival into elegance. Their bond deepened with time, not through grand declarations, but through steady presence. Adam helped Ethan photograph his first full collection, arranging backdrops in the backyard, convincing friends from the community to model pieces that carried both defiance and tenderness. The photographs traveled further than they imagined, shared across forums and small publications, until orders began to trickle in. Soon, what had once been a humble workshop became a name whispered with respect in circles far beyond their town. Yet Ethan never forgot the root of it all. The walls of the workshop bore reminders of where he came from: a framed photo of Rose smiling in the garden, scraps of fabric from his earliest failures pinned like badges of honor, and on a shelf, the original sewing machine polished but no longer used, a relic that symbolized survival. Each client who entered felt the story woven into the air. They did not just buy garments, they carried away fragments of resilience stitched into fabric. As success grew, Ethan faced choices that tested his discipline. There were nights when exhaustion tempted him to skip his routine, mornings when the pressure of deadlines made him question his strength. But Adam's steady encouragement and Rose's unwavering faith kept him rooted. Together, they reminded him that discipline was not a cage, but a path to freedom. Ethan's workshop became a refuge, not just for himself, but for others who needed to believe that rejection could be transformed into purpose. Each thread pulled through fabric was a reminder that broken things could still be made whole. And in that truth lay a lesson. Strength is not the absence of pain or fear, but the decision to rise anyway. Ethan's life taught in those around him that even when society calls you unworthy, you can choose to create worth from your own hands. His garments were more than designs. They were declarations that no story is ever finished just because someone else decided to turn the page. Time reshaped Ethan Miller's life into something he once thought impossible. The fragile boy with trembling hands at a sewing machine had grown into a man whose name carried weight far beyond the boundaries of his small town. His workshop had become a studio of renown, his designs gracing queer festivals, intimate weddings, and quiet celebrations where clothing became a language of dignity. Beside him, Adam remained not just a partner in business, but the anchor of his heart. And within the same modest home, Grandma Rose, though aged and frail, lived to see the boy she rescued bloom into a man of grace and resilience. The rhythm of life in that house was slower now. Mornings began with the Adam brewing coffee, the rich aroma drifting into the workshop where half-finished garments waited patiently. Afternoons often found Ethan tending to Rose, reading aloud from her favorite novels, or sitting beside her as she dozed in a chair by the window. The world outside may have changed, but within those walls, family had been carefully woven from threads of loyalty and love. It was on one of those quiet afternoons that a sound shattered the ordinary. A knock at the door, hesitant yet deliberate. Ethan set aside the fabric he was stitching and walked to answer, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor. But when the door creaked open, the past stood on the threshold. Paul and Ellen, his parents, their hair, once dark and stern, had faded into brittle strands of gray. Their bodies seemed smaller, shrunken by years and regret. In their eyes was no trace of the authority that had once cast him into the cold. Instead, there was a weight of sorrow that bent their shoulders low. Ellen's lips trembled as she spoke his name. Paul's hand gripped the doorframe as if he needed it to keep himself upright. Tears welled before their words could even settle. They spoke of mistakes, of guilt carried like stones in their chests, of nights spent replaying the memory of the boy they had driven into the dark. They asked not for immediate forgiveness, but for a chance to see him again, to know him not as a ghost of their choices, but as the man he had become. Behind Ethan, Rose appeared, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. Her voice, though weakened by age, carried a fire that time had not dimmed. She reminded them of that winter night, of the cruelty of turning away a son when he needed love the most. Her words cut through the silence like a blade, each syllable demanding they confront the full measure of their betrayal. Ethan stood motionless, his hands resting against the frame of the door. He felt the years collapse into a single memory, the sound of his backpack's zipper breaking as he packed his life in a hurry. The taste of snow as tears froze on his face, the endless echo of his father's condemnation. The boy inside him, the one who had begged silently for warmth, still stirred restlessly. Yet so did the man, the one who had built an empire from thread and survived by the grace of love, given freely by those who never abandoned him. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. Adam stood nearby, watching, but offering no interruption. Knowing this moment belonged to Ethan alone, Rose's eyes stayed fixed on her son and daughter-in-law, unyielding, fierce in her defense of the grandson she had raised when they refused. Ethan finally spoke, though his words came slowly, each one weighed down with the years between then and now. He did not invite them in immediately, nor did he slam the door shut. Instead, he stood at the threshold, torn between the memory of abandonment and the undeniable truth that the people before him were no longer the same as the ones who had driven him out. The moment was not about erasing the past, nor was it about indulging in vengeance. It was about confronting the shape of love when it has been starved for too long. Ethan's chest tightened, not with hatred, but with the aching recognition that some wounds never disappear, even when time blurs their edges. And within that tension lies a truth worth remembering. Forgiveness is not a door swung open without thought, nor is it a wall built forever high. It is a path that demands honesty, courage, and the willingness to face the shadows cast by choices once made. In that doorway, Ethan understood that the question was not simply whether his parents deserved forgiveness, but whether he was ready to offer it without betraying the boy he once was. The air inside the workshop was heavy with silence as Ethan Miller finally stepped aside, motioning for Paul and Ellen to follow him in. They entered hesitantly, their footsteps uncertain on the polished wooden floor. The walls seemed to speak before Ethan did, for every inch of space carried the weight of his story. Photographs lined the room, snapshots of childhood birthdays where Rose alone stood beside him. Pictures of his first rough designs hung proudly though imperfect. Moments with Adam captured in warm light, and more recent portraits of Ethan at fashion shows. His creations celebrated by those who once would have dismissed him. Not a single frame bore the faces of the parents now standing in the room. Their absence was louder than any accusation. Paul's eyes darted from one image to the next, his lips pressing into a thin line. Ellen clutched her hands together, trembling at the realization of years lost. Ethan paused before the oldest photograph, himself as a child, arms wrapped around a rose in a garden of late summer blooms. "Every step of my life since that night," he said, his voice steady though thick with emotion, "was carried not by you but by her. When I needed comfort, she was there. When I needed strength, Adam was there. Blood did not keep me alive. Love did." His words fell like stones into the silence. Paul's shoulders shook, and for the first time, the man who had once spoken with thunder seemed reduced to nothing more than a shadow of regret. Ellen covered her face, tears streaming freely, her voice breaking as she whispered apologies into the stillness of the workshop. But Ethan did not reach for them. He had spent too many years rebuilding from the wreckage they left behind. He was not a boy pleading for their embrace anymore. He was a man deciding what their presence in his life could mean now. Slowly, he turned and faced them fully. "You cannot erase what you did," he said. "You cannot step back into the years you abandoned. But if you want a place in this life, then prove it. Use the time you have left to fight for kids like me, kids whose parents choose pride over love. Stand up for them, protect them, make sure they never feel the cold I felt that night." The demand was not spoken in anger, but with the firmness of truth. It was the only path toward forgiveness he could offer. Anything less would cheapen the years of pain, the sacrifices of Rose, and the unwavering love Adam had given him. Paul and Ellen wept openly now, broken not just by guilt, but by the clarity of the task before them. They nodded, though no words could capture the depth of what they had lost. Ethan did not step closer, nor did he push them away. He allowed space, a fragile opening where redemption could begin, but only if they chose to walk it. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow across the workshop, Ethan turned toward the two people who had never left his side. Rose, now fragile yet radiant with pride, and Adam, steady as ever, took his hands. Together, they stood beneath the light pouring through the windows, the room glowing as if to mark a truth Ethan had long understood: family is not determined by blood, but by those who choose to stay. And so the story did not end with reconciliation easily granted. It ended with a choice. Paul and Ellen would have to prove with actions, not words, whether they could ever earn a place in Ethan's life again. For those listening now, perhaps the question lingers in your own heart: if someone who abandoned you came back years later in tears, would you forgive them, or would you let them live with the weight of what they did? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know how you see it. And don't forget to follow Heart Stories, where we bring you stories that challenge the meaning of family, love, and redemption.